Welcome to the Health System CIO Show. I'm your host, founder, and editor-in-chief, Anthony Guerra. On today's episode, I'll be speaking with Mike Ratliff, CISO at Providence. Mike, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
All right, great. Appreciate it. Let's start off with a little bit, if you want to give us a little bit about your organization and your role.
Yeah, so Providence is a nonprofit mission-driven health system. We cover 7 states, around 50 hospitals, about 1,000 clinics, and about 150,000 caregivers. Additional, maybe 40,000 physicians that also come in as well as contract. But yeah, large health system, and we try to stay true to our values as an organization. I myself, I've been the CISO of Providence for roughly about 14 months now. I lead the cybersecurity team, and as of recently, I am now leading the emergency management for the enterprise as well.
Well, that's fascinating, and that really is going to play into what we're going to talk about today. But let's go back a little bit because I did interview your predecessor, Adam Zoller.
Mhm.
Had a great chat with him a while back. Um, when you took over the position, you had been with the organization. So I always find it interesting, like prioritization. When you came in. Um, there were probably you'd been there, so there were some things you wanted to work on. There were some initiatives you wanted to lean into more than others. You want to tell me a little bit about that sort of thought process when you jumped into the role, where you wanted to spend some of your time?
Yeah, so a lot of it really over, the 12 years I've been at Providence, I've seen the up and downs and I've seen the different organization structures as well. And, it really gives you a chance to understand what works,
Hmm.
and opportunities to try new things. Historically we were a SecOps, GRC, Office of CISO type of organization. And I wanted to change that up. So I went with, dividing the teams up into threat detection and response, security engineering, and then what I call GRAC, is GRC, but I put attack surface management into GRC to better align risk with vulnerabilities across the enterprise.
All right, very good. Well, let's go right into this fascinating change with you taking or taking the reins at emergency management. Is that how you would describe it?
Yeah.
Because I mean, that's really interesting because what we're talking about today, one of the biggest issues in the industry is business continuity, resilience, maintaining operations when applications have to come offline. Either figuring out how to keep them online somewhere else, as in an isolated recovery environment. We did a story on that. Centaura was doing something around that. We did a story on that. It was number one on our site
Mm.
for about a month. And then I just put up a story yesterday. We'll get into this a little bit. I know you've done some work with the AHA and the FBI, some tabletops. They just put out something yesterday over the last couple of days where they've got some offering to help people out around resiliency and recovery. I put
Mhm.
that up yesterday, and that was number one immediately. The interest around disaster recovery and business continuity is through the roof. So let me start with your thoughts on it just seems like it's exploded in terms of interest. What are your thoughts?
Well, so there's a small wave coming towards us, all health systems, and it could end up being a tidal wave down the road. The way that our security team kind of looks at this is the third party attacks are happening on a weekly basis. It used to be maybe one or two a month, but now we're getting 1 to 2 a week, from our supply chain. With that, as organizations, we got to get better at, understanding our asset inventory, understanding exactly what is considered critical infrastructure. And, as you dive into critical infrastructure, you have your ping power and pipe, your compute, your access, stuff like that. But ideally, we often look at it long term as these are IS priorities, you know, which don't always match clinical operations.
Right.
So part of our endeavor now, and we call it Project Oscar, to get us started, is really synchronizing between managing the work, which is, day-to-day operations, not only from an IS perspective, from a clinical operations perspective. So what we want to do is we want to sit down with our doctors and our nurses and our hospital administration and really take a look at show us the day in the life.
Uh,
One of the prime examples is we took two different hospitals in two different regions and we sat down with labor and delivery and NICU, and we had them walk us through their day. What is the technology they use? What is the process from, checking in a expected mother and, going through every phase of what they needed to do throughout the day until they checked out. And, from a cyber perspective, we don't typically go to the hospital that often, and that's kind of changing now. But it allowed us to actually have really valuable conversations around what is truly critical for them to operate, not what IS interprets, but what do they need. And that actually helped us out quite a bit. And my thing is as a cybersecurity person for a hospital system, if you ever doubt what you're doing or who you're doing it for, visit a NICU. See a little infant, the size of a size 9, shoebox, plugged up to wires and monitors. Nurse is there, 24 hours a day watching this little baby trying to survive. That's why we do cybersecurity for health system.
so I mean, it's really interesting to me. It's almost like a gap analysis, right? So you're sitting there and you could theoretically, which we've always done, you've theorized about what they need or what they're doing, and you've got some ideas about applications and infrastructure and things like that. And then going over and seeing it firsthand and those aha moments where
Mhm.
you come up with the oh, didn't realize you used that or didn't realize you did that. Also, the clinicians could probably never explain it to you because they don't know a lot of the underlying technologies that are allowing them to do what they do.
Right.
So it's really that sort of going to Gemba, as they say, going there, sitting there, watching, and those. I would imagine there were some interesting aha moments.
There was, there were certain assumptions that we made from a IS perspective of, okay, well, this technology is down, you can't communicate. And they kind of explained to us, well, this technology, it might be down from the network, but it still operates. It still collects the logs. It's just local, and it provides the, fetal monitoring or something like that. And they can still operate at a lower capacity, but it's still there. And then also, as you think about, the BPA devices that are there, the emergency workstations, those are devices that, should be tested on a regular basis and not annually. And then, part of that conversation is if your network's down, so is your badging system. How's the nurse or doctor going to get into the room? So a lot of things we could kind of sit down and talk through. And then we started talking about, how long labor and delivery can, withstand paper charting before having to hire new staff or temporary staff to get us by. Um, and the whole purpose of this was to really go through what would happen if we were the next large health system that had a 30-day outage. So a lot of information was collected. We're going to reassess the entire organization when it comes to service continuity plans for all hospitals. We're going to drive down to clinics, as well as our physician network as well. We need to have good documents and good data to be able to correlate what truly makes sense and then take it back to them and say, okay, we got our critical infrastructure, but what's the next layer? What's the next thing that you need to make the day easier if we have an outage, and we'll bring it up systematically at that point. eventually it'll be to the point where that trusted relationship between the clinical side and the IS side, really partners together to build a more robust model
Right.
for resiliency.
It's just, I mean, it's overwhelming to think about. Like when I think about it, it's overwhelming, and I just don't know how you approach it. I mean, you have to have a way, right? Like you said, criticality
Yeah.
first, but I mean, you just get into the weeds on this thing, and it makes you understand patient diversion. Just send them somewhere else right now because we can't get back up, and we don't want to work on paper because the clinicians are not used to it. They're not comfortable with it. Send the patient somewhere else. So you understand that, but that's what you're trying to avoid, right?
Right, right. And no, you're 100% correct. At first glance, when I start looking at everything, it was like, what did I get myself into? But I think building the right team as an enterprise structure, and then you have your champions that are in the field, that are in the hospital and clinics. So ideally, is building the structure behind what each hospital and region can do with the enterprise support. And this goes with consistency of how do we collect data, how do we use the data, as well as standardizing tabletop exercises from a senior leadership level, an IS level, region, hospital, clinic. We need to walk through all of these over the next few years of getting to the point of everybody is, used to doing, a tabletop exercise, and they can, call out where it's not working and where it is working, and they can help improve the overall structure for the organization.
Fascinating stuff. So I understand the importance of the tabletops, and I could see why they would be critical and eye-opening. So a couple questions around doing those. Number one would be scenarios. Scenarios are fascinating because you can come up with any scenario you want. You could, we could, that's important in these things being effective. You have to come up with scenarios that I guess push things and but are not ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
There's a nuclear war. Okay, well, forget it. We're not really worried about much else except spending the last minutes with our family. So that's at one end of the extreme, and you think about sort of blast radius in a sense, figuratively and maybe literally, but um, it's what's our scenario? Is it a outage to a hospital? Is it an outage to a region? Is it an outage to a state? Is it an outage to half the country? And that informs how we have to structure our backup. Do we need something in another country? So you can get as crazy as you want with these scenarios. So my first question, and we're always trying to give people advice, is um, how do you structure scenarios? What's your thoughts there on coming up with scenarios for tabletops? And how do you decide who needs to be in the room? Because everyone's busy in healthcare.
Yeah, it's well, I think the benefit of what we got at Providence is we have a senior leadership that I report to that is 100% behind resiliency and doing tabletop exercises. From our CEO down, a lot of us understand the importance, and we've got to be prepared for it. But in that manner, I would say don't try to bite off everything at once. Start at the executive level as your primer, and this is where AHA and the FBI were very helpful in a tabletop exercise that we did on-prem in our Renton headquarters. We had a good 30 plus senior executives come into the room, and John Riggy and did
Yeah.
a fantastic job. We had our local FBI representatives that attended the full time and provided input on threat landscape, as well as the partnership that we have with them. But it was eye-opening at that point because for most part at that time we didn't have a delegation of authority. When can Mike turn off the internet because I'm seeing too much lateral movement? When can a CTO turn off the internet? Blocking everything from the organization. So these are questions that came up. Additionally, one of the things that came out of that tabletop was, we have clinical leaders that weren't receiving threat intelligence reports like we send our other executives. That was really good to have a conversation with, not as a scare tactic, threat intelligence, but making them aware of what we're facing as an organization. And further fortifies why we need to do resiliency.
Yeah. So they just came out. I suspect that the work that the AHA did with you has helped them put together this program that they just announced
Mhm.
with the Joint Commission. Because again, as I mentioned, we just put a story out on it, just came out, so seems to be huge interest in that. And I guess people are looking for help in terms of getting their mind around how to get started because it's not so they're not going to come in and do the work for you, obviously. That's not they're not consultants, but they're going to help you understand what work you need to do, which it sounds like was what they maybe did for you, and that can be extremely helpful in and of itself.
Yeah, John and Scott have been really great to work with. Besides the tabletop exercise, we do meet regularly, as well as they did provide myself as a new CISO some pointers on, okay, this is a couple steps that you can take to get started. Because they realize, as well as most of us do, taking on no matter what your health system size is, taking on this endeavor requires a lot of thought and requires a lot of participation from all levels of the organization.
Right, right. A little more from you about working with the there's so much has to intertwine here. So, I mean, you draw pictures, in your notes, and there's IT and IS sort of as one entity, although I guess you could think of them separately, but let's think of them as one entity for our purposes here. You've got emergency management, which now you are heading. So I'd love for you to tell us about that because that relationship, usually we speak of it as separate, and we talk about how the CISO needs to engage with emergency management and
Mhm.
how important that is. So you've got that entity, then you've got your vendors. That's another entity, and then your operations people. So you've got a lot of constituencies that you need to work with if you want to move forward in this area. But let's start with operations. What's your best advice to your colleagues on and you mentioned executive engagement. That helps. But what's your best advice other than that of how to get busy clinicians to give you some time? So, you're like, "Hey, I'm trying to help us here. I need your time." How do you position that? How do you set that up?
Asked very nicely.
Let's say please.
Um, uh, no, from that perspective, our chief operating officer has been very supportive, and he's part of our overall Project Oscar steering committee. And he helps reinforce the message to all of the hospital administration and physicians around, okay, this is why we need to do this. So I would definitely, as a CISO, um, you know, spend time with your COO and understand what their concerns are, understand how best to approach the hospital administration if you're not used to it. And then also, just set up some engagement time so
Yeah.
you can kind of explain what we're trying to do. Having some time with the clinicians to kind of explain the program, what you're trying to prevent down the road. And it's all about, the less patient care impacting that we can get as an organization through maturity. And then from there, walk them through the first one, spend that time with them into how, okay, we're going to dive into labor and delivery. We don't want to impact ambulatory or acute care because they seem to be quite a bit busier right now. So we'll start with one that is kind of consistent across our 51 hospitals. You will have some variances here and there, but I would say 80% is about the same. Um, And once you get start getting the clinical staff on board, they are more than willing to have a conversation, especially if you can derive the aha moments around, this might be for resiliency piece, but this is another problem that maybe we should take back to our IT team
Uh-huh.
and say, hey, this is what our nurses and our doctors are dealing with on a daily basis. Is there anything we can do about it? Like, it could be your Wi-Fi AP having a bad signal in a certain location. Just having conversations in the hospital and understanding their pain points. It also goes a long way as well.
All right, very good. Tell me about the evolution of you taking over emergency management. I find that fascinating.
Well, we actually, so the way that we kind of looked at it is we want a greater tie between cybersecurity and emergency management. And the focus was really around a ransomware incident.
Right.
Um, and we needed to start building a new partnership as we move forward. Conversations with our CIDO, COO, and our executive council, it kind of went through. They explained the reason, the why, the benefits of being able to do it. Because as cybersecurity people, we are technology owners as well as we handle crisis every day. It might be minute for a couple workstations being infected, or a third-party vendor having a security incident or a breach. So we deal with it every day. So the marriage of the crisis and the disaster recovery, it kind of plays very well into how you want to build an emergency management system. So that it, the conversations were quite well, and now we're starting to build the structure around everything.
So does that mean you're going to own all of emergency management, including non-cyber incidents like hurricanes
Yes.
and so
Yeah.
you you got it all. You're so
Not at all.
lucky.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a huge opportunity. I am
Yeah,
so excited to drive into this.
yeah,
And we have a lot of our cybersecurity team members that are interested as well in this new pillar that we're going to have alongside cybersecurity. There's technology tools like something like an Everbridge. We can incorporate the information from that into our threat intelligence. So we can not only tell you about the threat actors coming at us, we can also tell you in the same breath that, okay, you also got to be aware of you have this say a hurricane is coming,
right,
or God forbid, a typhoon coming off the coast of Japan. Uh, you know, it'll also simplify communications as well as a greater understanding of how do we communicate in a crisis. You have very different means. Some people use something like a Teams or a Slack for IS stuff. But then on the flip side, you have Everbridge that is utilized in the hospital spaces. So how does that marriage work? Uh,
right.
and how do we get the a more consistent messaging through templates down to our frontline staff that is hands-on with patients.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. I wonder if we'll see more of that. I mean, I wonder if this could become a trend, sort of CISOs taking over emergency management.
It really depends on the organization, I would think. Sometimes through mergers, acquisitions, and the way that hospitals reorganize, sometimes there's a means to reevaluate how your emergency management works. And this was just that time for us.
Hmm.
I have the staff, we have the budget, and we have the gumption to just get things done.
So that there was some existing structure there that comes under you, so to speak.
Um, There's a couple that count. But I'm building the team internally through some of our cyber security team that is very interested in taking on career development work. So
Yeah.
I look at it as from a career development perspective for a cybersecurity practitioner is you open up two routes for them. Typically, and I've seen in most health systems, the CRO is typically the owner of risk for the enterprise, which also includes emergency management. And then you have the CISO that's all about the cyber risk and the day-to-day blocking and tackling. This actually gives some of our caregivers that want to move into EM two career paths that they can educate themselves on and also go to. So if you want to be a CRO one day, you need to understand emergency management. You need to understand risk. If you want to be a CISO, you need to understand nation state actors and how to block and tackle, whether it be firewalls or EDRs, you name it. So it actually opens up quite a bit, and I'm real excited for that opportunity for my team.
Well, I can't think of a more interesting or probably growing in importance area than, you've got, as you said, cybersecurity and healthcare, which is top of the list. And now you've got emergency management, resilience slash cybersecurity. I mean, if my kids would listen to me, I would say go there, become an expert in emergency management slash cybersecurity and healthcare. Go. Because I think you'll be in huge demand if you could develop an expertise to say, yeah, I did it over there. We developed the program. It's much better off than when I started. I mean,
Yeah,
go anywhere in the country.
yeah, yeah. And and with that in mind, there's a lot of concern across all of IT industry. Well, AI is going to take my job. AI is going to help us quite a bit.
Right,
It'll help us with documentation, templatizing, automating. These are great things that we can do at the organization and also making sense of data. We
right.
all collect data. But in the end, somebody that knows how to run a tabletop exercise, somebody that knows how to engage in a crisis, AI is not going to take that because you have to be able to understand how a hospital operates. You have to be able to have good communication skills. When chaos is all around you, you have to have somebody with a calm demeanor in the room.
Well, that's 100% right. I mean, and AI doesn't give you that. Um, when I joked with you about engaging with clinicians and you said, say please, I mean, that was a joke, but there's so much in that. There's so much of being successful at any kind of significant level of understanding human beings. And clinicians are a unique breed of human beings, and
Mhm.
especially high level clinicians, and to understand how to get their engagement requires some emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And I know you have a military background, right?
Mm.
You don't give orders to these people. You
Yeah.
ask nicely. So AI is not going to fix that, and you could have the greatest information, the greatest plan. If you don't know how to engage with people who are busy and require respect to be treated with some deference, you're not going to get anywhere in a position of a CISO.
Yeah, yeah. The big thing with that, working with the hospital so far, and I have a lot further to go, a lot more hospitals to visit and conversation to have. But ideally, as a an IS person, we call IT IS here. So as an IS person, walking in the room with clinicians and frontline staff, you have to leave all your thoughts at the door and be completely open to understand their pain points,
Right.
understand how they do things, because we have some brilliant, nurses and physicians across our enterprise. These are people that I met a nurse that's been at the organization for over 30 years. She knows everything, and I just want to sit down with her for like hours and say, "Tell me about all of this,"
Right.
because it's that piece of getting to the hospital, walking the floor, understanding. And it's a great conversation to have. Like I said, I think every CISO or security person should spend time in the hospital. Do it to where you're not impacting operations,
Right.
but you should spend time learning what you're protecting and who you're protecting.
I couldn't agree more. If I had like one observation from all my discussions I've had with people, it's that to be successful in these roles, spend as much time with your users as possible. The more
Mhm.
time you're in the hospital, the more time you're talking to them. Like if you look at your calendar and you're not doing that, that's a bad sign. Like actually play games with the metrics. Like
Mhm.
there should be a number. You should look at your calendar and go like 30%. Like it's just to me, it's the number one indicator of whether or not someone's going to be successful.
Yeah, most of us don't like looking at our calendars. And it becomes, and mine's even worse because I color code everything because I have a little autistic nature to me. Um, so everything is color coded. But then I look at my calendar, it's like, okay, these are all, IS meetings.
Yeah.
These are a lot of you got to start thinking about, okay, am I truly needed for this meeting, or can one of my direct reports make the decision for me? They understand our strategy, not only from an organization or an IS or a cybersecurity side, but they understand what we need to do. So why would I need to attend that meeting? I need to get back out into the field. COVID kind of wrecked everything to where, everybody stayed away from each other. RTO went in a very similar path. But getting back to the hospital is what one of the things I am looking forward to is, sitting down and coordinating some time, understand where we can help, and most of the time, how do we get out of their way so they can do what they need to do best?
Right. It's funny. You have to not get in their way, but you have to get some time with them in order to figure out how to get out of their way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of funny. Let's talk a little bit about that other pillar in the stool, the vendors. I interviewed the CTO of Mass General Brigham in Boston, and he wrote a piece, and we talked about it about how you have to. He said basically, as IT professionals, we stopped asking our SaaS providers some important questions about resiliency and redundancy, and there have been some outages where we learned some things where they had exposure and they had certain lack of redundancies and there were outages. So he wrote a piece. So we have to ask more questions. We stopped asking important questions. And his point wasn't that his point was that they'll tell you if you ask, but you need to ask so you know. So
Yeah.
if you talk about these third party supply chains, and it's a really interesting point because sometimes it's not you, sometimes it's not your vendor, it's the third party your vendor's using, which could be a fourth party or a fifth party. And you might hear about that fourth or fifth party going down in the news, and you don't want to be in a position at that point of figuring out, do we use it or does one of our vendors use it? It'd be great to have all that documented ahead of time so that when your boss comes to you and says, does this impact us? Someone just sent this to me. You say, no, we're good. Or, yeah, we have an issue and I'm on it, as opposed to, well, let me find out. It's that whole SBOM thing, right? At a different
Yeah.
level. It's like we need to know what we have so we know when we have a problem.
Yeah. This is a huge thing, and we kind of started going down this route with AI, actually. But it also the first part is you got to have the data. You got to have who is what's the assets, who's the business owner internally, who's your account manager. That has to be in your records, whether you use ITSM, Remedy, ServiceNow, whatever. You have to have it. The other piece of that is, as we have actually built a tool internally, because we collect so much data into a what I call a swamp. Most people has a data lake, but that's the good stuff. We call it a swamp because we have all the cyber stuff.
Uh-huh.
So being able to use, hey, a new exploit dropped on this from this vendor's product, and it's this version, this and this. So we actually uh, we query every 4 to 8 hours, and we search the entire data pool of everything we have to see, okay, do we have this in the environment? So it's an automated scan of an entire data set, and it provides a report back. Yes, you do have this here. you have this revision, and you actually have 15 of these, and they're located at this hospital, or this administration building. So this is a part to where AI can help a lot of people, because otherwise you're going to go through your vulnerability scanning logs, you're going to go through your EDR logs, you're going to look at your firewalls, you're going to try to pull all these different dashboards into one to build that story and say, oh yeah, 3 hours later, we found this. But in 15 minutes, AI can find everything for you.
Yeah, and that's kind of the beauty of AI. So sometimes it's not that it's directly coming into play in what you're doing,
Mhm.
as an actual tool. But it's that second level, that information gathering and analysis that it does so well that you can leverage, that anybody should be leveraging, right? That
Yeah.
goes across any human being on the planet. You should be using it that way. So, um, there's that. There's a lot of concerns about um, it on the attacker side being leveraged. Um, I don't know. Are you worry about this stuff? I mean, obviously you worry, but um, you optimistic or pessimistic?
Um, I'm not optimistic.
That's honest.
Um, you know, I've been in the IT field for 36 years. Been doing cyber specifically, starting in the military from 2000, yeah, 2000,
Uh-huh.
getting older. Um, it's hard to keep up.
Yeah.
It really is. And we have a development team. We have everybody studying and reading and training on AI, but it is changing every other week. There's new updates to, say Claude or OpenAI, whatever the flavor people have, it just changes so drastically and quickly. You're finding yourself having to read every week, what is the latest
Right.
thing? Um, and you can't even cover all of it. You have to cover what's in your enterprise. Whether it's through a GitHub Copilot or something like that, or whatever flavor LLMs that somebody's using. Now we have NCPs. We have a lot of vendors that are building up in their own NCP service that you can build on house
Oh,
to be able to tie data back and forth. It is changing so rapidly, and honestly, I find myself at least once a week reading up on what is the latest AI that is in respect to Providence's health system that we utilize.
right.
And that's why I'm not optimistic per se, is at a certain point, there's going to be too much AI in the environment, and we need to understand how to limit that. We need, as an organization, we need to innovate, like every other health system.
Right.
We need to be able to provide the AI tools for our teams and even our physicians, scribing or helping doing research in a moment's notice. We have to enable this, but we also, on the flip side, have to understand what we don't enable and keep it blocked away from everybody. So, uh,
Yeah.
yes, I'm optimistic to the front where it's going to help, but I'm not optimistic that the entire industry is not prepared for a tidal wave that's going to hit us.
Yeah, Gartner just put out a thing I saw about sprawl, agent sprawl, and
Mhm.
it's that messy drawer. It's the drawer, things this came up around identity. People continually getting permissions added onto their identities and them never being removed when they no longer needed
Mhm.
them.
Yep.
The term spaghetti was used. um, you know and you think of it with, if it could happen around with agents, that
Yeah.
people are continually spinning things up and nobody spins anything down, and we don't even know what's going on.
Yeah. Well, if you look at it, you can base your primary accounts on three different areas. Um, uh, you have your human account. This is the account that we use every day to do our daily job. You'll have okay, if I'm an administrator, I need to go into our PIM or our PAM and go in. I need just in time admin access to take care of this.
Right.
And then you have the non-human accounts. And this is kind of where the new frontier is hitting us as well, is old days it was about a service account. Okay, I have a service account, I can do all this, and you have your RBAC model and stuff like that. But part of the new realm in a non-human account is the agent account.
Right.
And we have kill switches over time, that all of us have worked on for human accounts and service accounts, and we have inventories of, how many service accounts we got, not, we do our best, like most organizations. But now we're handing agents a privileged access so it can run a service, whether it be to read or write or make a change. That is now something that all of us are going to deal with, and we have to understand what is the kill switch. Where is it at, and how can we do it in a moment's notice? You can't be on a bridge, a cyber bridge or a technology bridge, and trying to figure out who owns that agent, and how do we turn it off? You know, um, so that goes back to the data. When you are building an agent or internally, or when you have a third party that is bringing in an agent, you should have a record of it. You should have, and you should also have a conversation. All right, we're going to implement this. This is going to everything that it can do. How do we turn it off?
Yeah.
And how do we turn it off in minutes, vice hunting somebody down and it take hours?
Wow. Great stuff, Mike. We're just about out of time. Maybe time for a final thought, final piece of advice for your colleagues here. Any words to the wise?
Uh, get into the hospital. Spend more time with your clinicians. And as a CISO, work with all your other CISOs. So there are some people that are doing things better than us,
Hmm.
and there's certain things that we might be doing better than them. Collaborate, figure it out. We're not going to win this battle, or the war single-handedly. It's going to take a collective, whether it is building something together, or helping with templates to each other, or how our processes are working. But it's going to take all of us to get through this.
Well said, Mike. This was a lot of fun. Incredible interview. I want to thank you so much for your time, and I hope we can catch up with you down the road. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank
Have a
you.
great day. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.